Chapter 11. Tom, Norma, Fruit Farming. With 2 fires behind us within 6 months and debts up to our ears, we were really feeling sorry for ourselves, but we had yet to learn the true meaning of the word tragedy. Tom was having trouble with his teeth, and Dr. Allison in Stony Creek was our dentist for both Florence and Tom. He was an excellent dentist and very gentle and considerate. As Tom was getting toothaches periodically, he decided that 2 of the primary double teeth should be removed. He suggested that Dr. Critch in Grimsby was the man to do the job because he had the equipment to administer gas and was considered to be one of the best in our area. Christmas was fast approaching, and as nothing can spoil a holiday like a toothache, we got an appointment for the 23rd of December. Lib, Tom, and I arrived well in advance of the 9:00 a.m. appointment, and nearly as soon as we were in the office, Dr. Critch gave Tom a pill to relax the tension. When his turn came, Tom marched into the dentist chair with not a care in the world. We were asked to remain in the waiting room, after being assured he would be back within 15 minutes. After the 15 minutes had passed, the extra commotion in the other room gave us both the feeling that something was not right. Another 5 minutes passed, and I could wait no longer, so I knocked on the door and asked what was the trouble. When the nurse came out of the door and said, "Everything is all right, he is still breathing," we both realized how serious the situation had become. There is no way I could explain the anxiety of the following half hour. Thoughts ran through my mind 100 miles an hour that included everything from murder to utter despair. I knew Lib was 2 months pregnant and not really capable of coping with so drastic a situation. When Dr. Critch appeared in the doorway, his expression told us the bad news before his voice. He explained that he had called another local doctor and neither of them could revive Tom. It was all over. He gave Lib a pill to calm her down while I phoned Ralph Natman to take her home. I remained to make arrangements as soon as I could think logically. Christmas presents were stacked in the attic, and in their stead, a small coffin holding our only son, resting peacefully in the living room. It is my observation that it is not the amount of money one accumulates, nor the worldly possessions you may have that determines the amount of happiness in one's life, but rather the privilege of sharing the happiness, the profits, the losses, the joys, and the sorrow with those you love the most. On July 7, 1952, Norma Libby DeWitt came into our lives, a normal 7-pound bundle of joy. To us, the most beautiful baby in the world. Her very existence seemed to dull the pain of the loss of the 2 baby girls, and most recently our son Tom. You may well imagine how thankful and overwhelmed with gratitude we felt, having been given the opportunity of raising another child. Florence, now 12 years old, came with us to bring the new baby from the hospital. She held Norma in her arms all the way home and seemed to be as proud as her mother. We were, understandably, overprotective, and again Flo was not allowed the freedom with the baby she should have had to regain her own self-confidence. Norma was now in the limelight, and Florence once again in the shadows. It was not because we loved Florence less, but rather that we were too stupid to realize that every child requires and deserves a place of equal importance in the family, that she herself could recognize. Let's deal with fruit farming in general, the way I see it. Starting in January, or better still, that season called winter, you have nearly 5 months to complete the pruning of the trees and vines. It is only important to have these jobs finished before the middle of May. If it were possible to do the whole thing in a week, then the best week would be one in April. In Ontario, by this time, the sap has begun to flow fast enough to afford a more rapid healing of all the cuts and bruises the trees sustain during a normal pruning operation. The book, from the experimental farm, says, "The time to prune is when the knife is sharp," but for some, this never happens, so the theory is not too accurate either. Dead limbs are more easily identified as the season gets later and the quantity of buds can be judged with greater accuracy, allowing the pruner to cut heavy or light, whichever the trees requires. In any case, the pruning is the only operation of the fruit farm that is not on a strict schedule. Grapes come first on the list for 2 reasons. 1, they must be pruned every year in order to have them produce quality berries and bunches. The vine is pruned down to 35 or up to 50 buds, according to the health and vigor of the individual vine, from an original quantity of something over 400 buds. To not prune the vine for every 1 year would result in a total crop loss for the following 3 years. Therefore, to make sure the weather allows enough good pruning time, let's do them first. 2. If grapes are pruned later than April, every cut will exude moisture rather than heal over. It has never been proven that this has ill effects, but it sounds reasonable that liquid lost would have to be replaced by the vine in order to remain healthy and grow. There are many systems used to train the vines on wires. To name a few, the Niffen system, my choice, which has 6 canes or limbs protruding laterally from a much older, rigid vertical stalk to match the 3 wires which are 18, 42, and 60 inches from the ground. The oldest system, the fan, which has the old stalk running horizontally along the bottom wire and as many as 5 canes running vertically to the top wire. The umbrella system, an old stalk vertically from the ground to the top wire, with 4 long canes starting at the top wire and forming an arch back down to the bottom wire. There are many more, but these are the principal ones used in the Niagara Peninsula. The usual planting distance is 8 feet between vines in the row, with the rows 10 to 12 feet apart. Posts, either steel or wood, are placed so that there are 3 vines between each 2. If one dresses warmly enough to be comfortable, then pruning grapes can be a pleasure, otherwise it is a real drag. The challenge of trying to estimate the vigor of each vine, picking out the most productive canes, shaping the vine, when you know every cut has an influence on the next crop, keeps your interest sharp and alert. Cherry trees respond better, as do most other fruit trees, to annual pruning because lighter, smaller cuts are less of a shock and the scars, being smaller, heal faster. However, some years the weather does not cooperate to allow enough clear days to finish the job, so to miss an orchard for 1 year is such a tragedy as in the case of grapes. After cherries come the pears. They are inclined to grow straight and high, so the object here is to trim the trees so that it will be balanced, not too thick in the center and branched out wide from the trunk. Pears require about 10 years to reach a producing size, so if the desired limbs are allowed to grow long and spindly during this period, the first small crop will bend the branches down and form a frame from which an ideal tree may be developed. The rule of thumb is, if you want the limb to stay where it is now, cut about half of it off. If you want a horizontal limb, leave it as long as it is now. The growing habits for plum trees vary with every variety. Japanese varieties, such as Shiro or Early Golden, grow in any direction equally as well and are therefore very easily shaped. They grow vigorously and require severe trimming to produce large-sized plums. European varieties grow entirely differently, and each variety has its own recognizable shape. Lombards always overproduce and should be cut back to prevent too many broken limbs, while some varieties of prunes would not produce any fruit if they were pruned the same way. It all boils down to knowing the natural habits of each variety and pruning accordingly. Apples are the last on the list because they can withstand neglect better. They are hardy, vigorous, and are less susceptible to broken or dead limbs. Again, each apple variety requires a slightly different approach. The unfortunate part about pruning is that there is no hard and fast rule to guide you. Even among the so-called experts, there are no 2 men who would prune any given tree exactly the same. It takes many years to learn from your mistakes of the past what system of pruning works best for your farm. It is always fun to speculate as to the results when you lop off a limb with the 36-inch aluminum handheld pruners or cut a heavier limb with a saw. The pruning season, therefore, is a logical time to do your planning for the coming year or take on any extra projects. This explains the piecemeal program I used to rearrange the layout of the house. I moved walls, changed stairs, built cupboards, redirected or added equipment, all according to the time and money available for that season. One of the more ambitious efforts was in 1963 when we changed the old kitchen and the den of the frame part into a carport. It was one of the more drastic improvements and required a footing and a wall to replace the old rotted cedar posts. I used a 26.5 foot I-beam to support the south wall of the upstairs, and because it was important to have no uprights in the carport, the I-beams was 16 inches deep and 8 inches wide. It weighed 3 tons, so I hired a crane to lift it in place. Art Bentley cemented the floor and Art Bayless did the plastering of the walls and ceiling. The shed roof extended the 13-foot floor to 23 feet, so we had an area of 26 feet by 23 feet. Plenty of room for 2 cars with no posts and right at the back door of the house. This is also the time for a step up in social activities because of the shorter days and a relaxed schedule. It was the winter of 1945 that Jim Douglas started the bridge parties when they lived on Graham Avenue near the Delta Collegiate. He invited 5 other couples, including Hilda and Lloyd Suter, Betty and Bill Davy, Mary and Reed Johnson, and ourselves. Many parties followed on a loose monthly schedule for several years during the winter months, visiting each of the 6 homes alternatively. To sum up, the winter months, in spite of some miserable weather, are most welcome. A relief from the hustle and bustle of the harvest and the anxieties of spring and summer. There are very few pleasures in life that would compare favorably with the spring and operation of the fruit farm. Let's assume the pruning has been completed. Every day after the 1st of April brings more indication of nature's awakening. Everything seems to be poised and waiting to jump into the grand experience of life itself. Buds that have been dormant and dull miraculously shoot tender green tips into the world for the first time and present your first challenge. Keep them healthy to maturity. The return of migrating birds is timed with the emergence of insects that supply them with food. It would seem to be a privilege to be included in nature's plan to produce food for everyone to enjoy, especially when you know that the quality and quantity of the fruit will be in the direct proportion to the amount of skill and effort expended on your part of that plan. Not all insects are detrimental to the production of quality fruit. In fact, some are absolutely essential to assure proper pollination of the blossoms. It is therefore necessary to select spray material to be used in the pre-blossom sprays that will not harm the beneficial insects and still control the destructive ones, such as San Jose scale, mites of all descriptions, leaf roller, and red spider. Apple trees require a constant coverage of a good fungicide to prevent apple scab and mildew infections, and the amount of applications will depend entirely on the frequency of spring rains and air temperature. Each spring presents different problems in the application of these sprays. Anything from muddy ground to low temperatures can foul up a good blossom season. What I am trying to say is that regardless of how good the equipment is or how skillful or ambitious you may be, there's always a certain amount of luck involved in producing good fruit. The brush, or limbs removed from the trees in the process of pruning, is usually too plentiful to be worked into the ground successfully with a disc, although some springs give you little time for any other choice. Usually, the front-mounted brush rake on the tractor makes short work of gathering and burning of the trimmings. By having a fire at each end of the orchard, it is comparatively simple to make the trucking pay by pushing both ways and dumping each load on the fires. On this farm, the small tractor was plenty big enough for that job. In fact, on the larger rows, the brush could be packed so tight that it was difficult to burn, something like a bale of straw. This job requires very little manual labor, and the only danger is the possibility of stalling the tractor too close to the fire. So here is an ideal chance to observe the condition and requirements of each tree as you pass. Great brush becomes very brittle and easily cut with a disc or a rotavator, so the only brush removed from the vineyard is the very heavy stalks that have been cut out to renew an old vine. Ideally, I would have liked to build a machine that would shred all the brush and leave it on the ground to help add humus, but I considered that the cost outweighed the advantage. In the early days of my farming experience, we went through the orchards as soon as the trimmings was complete and saved all the limbs over 1.5-inch diameter to be used for firewood for the stoves in the house. For several years, this was our only supply of fuel. The tractor-driven circular saw provided an excuse to invite a few neighbors to lend a hand to keep it busy. It was hard work, but a fun day nevertheless. The spray schedule held top priority, and all their jobs worked around it. Timing was not important, allowing, in most cases, only 3 days for completion. Using the recommendations of Vineland Experimental Farm and one's own mistakes of the past, it was not too difficult to pick the right time and materials that worked best on this farm. The tougher problem was to get the weatherman to cooperate. I have sprayed in every conceivable way, including mud to the axles, too windy, too hot, too cold, or just right, before dawn or after dark, so long as the time was right. My first spray machine required 10 hours of rather hard work to apply 4 tanks of 160 gallons each, for a total of 640 gallons. That is, if it would run without a breakdown for 10 consecutive hours. The last machine had a 300-gallon tank, 3 times the capacity pump, plus a large fan to drive the fine spray right through every tree. In 10 hours, you could put out 12 tanks for a total of 3,600 gallons, more efficiently and with no more effort than is required to drive a tractor and turn taps. What an improvement. It was a 2-wheel trailer with airplane-type tires, 18-inch wide and 4-foot diameter, which allowed it to ride on top of the ground even in muddy conditions, and consequently much easier to pull than a smaller machine. Springtime is a time for speculation as to the prospects of your year's crop. I would suggest that every fruit grower is born with eternal hope for a better crop this year. The potential production of the whole farm is so great that it is hard to realize that it is impossible to reach it. Only experience will convince you that if the apples have had an excellent blossom season, then the cherries or plums have not, or vice versa. Let's consider this farm on a tree-to-tree basis. There are about 500 apple trees large enough to produce 20 bushels each, equaling 10,000 bushels. The most I ever had was a little over 6,500. 1,000 plum trees can easily have 20 6-quart baskets, each equaling 20,000. My tops, about 8,000. 500 cherry trees could produce 25 tons. My best, 14 tons. There are 1,000 Bartlett and 800 Kiefer pear trees, without considering the 100 or so pollinizing varieties, such as Anjou, Bosc, Coffrets, and Blemish Beauty, with a possible 6 bushels each. In other words, 150 tons Bartletts, 120 tons Kiefer. My tops about 50 tons each. Grapes are the most consistent crop, and although some rows produce 50 pounds to the vine, the 4,000 vines that should yield 100 tons rarely got over 48. So this is how it tallies up. Potential 10,000 bushels of apples, first crop 400 bushels, actual top crop 6,500 bushels. Potential 20,000 6-quart plums, first crop 2,000 by times 6, actual top crop 8 by 6. Potential 25 tons cherries, first crop 1.5 tons, actual top crop 14 tons. Potential 150 tons of Bartlett, first crop 2.5 tons, actual top crop 50 tons. Potential 120 tons of Kiefer, first crop 4 tons, actual top crop 50 tons. And last, potential top crop 100 tons of grapes, first crop 7 tons, actual top crop 48 tons. So the value in 1972 was $96,500. Value in 1936, $970. Value in 1972 of the actual top crop, $47,200. I must hasten to add that the top figures above were never reached in any one year. In fact, my top gross sale was in 1972 for $24,000. It is little wonder then, as you view the snow-white blossoms of cherries, pears and plums, and the delicate pink blossoms of apple trees, that it is so easy to believe this year will be the best ever. Just as all those who bet on horse races or buy sweepstakes tickets have a firm belief that their ticket is the winner, so do all fruit growers estimate their crop, even though the odds are about the same in either case. The challenge of cultivating the ground to the best advantage ever is present until the beginning of July. Not too wet, not too deep, not too often. Cultivation serves 2 purposes. It conserves moisture and promotes growth. Too wet causes our type of soil, being mostly clay, to bake into brick bats that cannot be broken up until the frost of the following year. Too deep will destroy too many of the following feeder roots, and too often will unnecessarily deplete the soil of valuable humus on which we depend to help maintain a good moisture content. The farm that is cultivated often enough to eliminate all weeds is not necessarily the best kept farm. In fact, if the spring rains are frequent and plentiful, then it is to your advantage to allow weeds to grow, as long as they are not robbing the trees of moisture. A good crop of weeds is just as valuable as a cover crop and less expensive. To sum up, spring is a time of year that is full of hope and promise, a time when everything puts on its best appearance, a time to marvel at nature's little quirks and daydream of the future. As June slides by, you are gradually pulled down from that high horse to a more logical and practical level, as all your mistakes and the shortcomings of the season register in a diminished crop. July will prove that you will have to offer for sales in both quantity and quality, and change your thinking from growing to harvesting. From the first day of picking cherries, the first day of August, to the last day of picking Kefir pears in October, there is little time to consider anything but harvesting and selling. To say you are busy would be a gross understatement. To have your 15 or 20 ladders ready, make arrangements for picking help, estimate your crop and make contracts, pick out delivery dates, all to the best advantage, is no small chore. Most of these plans are shuffled back and forth according to the whims of the weatherman, so every year presents different problems. Keep in mind, of course, that these harvest days are the only days of year which that money comes in instead of going out, so here is a result of your year's efforts. To have produced top quality fruit is equally as rewarding as its commercial value. To word it differently, the pride and pleasure a grower derives when he offers for sale the biggest Bartletts, the reddest, cleanest apples, or the sweetest grapes is just as great as valuable to him as the money he receives for them. To most city folks, farming or fruit growing is at the bottom of the list as far as requirements for skill or ability is concerned. Some would believe that anyone who is willing to work long hours and dig in a soil could be the ideal farmer. May I suggest that these are only the first two requirements. Here is a list of the rest: a good gambler, a businessman, a salesman, a planner, an entomologist, a biologist, a truck driver and tractor driver, a mechanic, a carpenter, and sometimes a plumber. Of course, it always helps to be a welder and a good weather prophet. If you keep animals, then you should understand animal husbandry, be a dietitian and a veterinarian. If you can keep books efficiently, it always helps, and to be able to meet people and handle labor problems is a must. It is lucky for me that good spelling is not too important. This seems to cover fruit growing in a general way, and specifically on this fruit farm. So let's go hunting. End of chapter 11.